I still remember the moment someone looked across the table and asked what sounded like a simple question. If millions of people escaped from Egypt, where is the evidence? The room went quiet, not because nobody had heard the question before, but because everyone immediately understood that the answer mattered for more than history. It touched family traditions, childhood memories, sermons, books, identity, trust, and the uncomfortable possibility that something can feel absolutely certain without being historically easy to verify. Maybe you have experienced that feeling yourself. Someone asks a question you never considered because you never had to. Suddenly you realize that what you thought was a settled fact might actually belong to a much larger conversation. That moment is unsettling because it exposes something about human psychology that reaches far beyond religion. We are remarkably good at confusing familiarity with evidence. We assume that if we have heard something our entire lives, everyone must know it is true for the same reasons we do. But familiarity is not a historical method. It is a psychological one. Our brains evolved to trust what our community repeats because belonging has always been essential for survival. Long before people argued about archaeology or ancient texts, belonging to the tribe often meant staying alive. That instinct never disappeared. It simply found new places to live: families, nations, political movements, religious communities, academic circles, online groups. Every one of them develops stories that become part of shared identity. Once that happens, questioning the story feels like questioning the people who shaped your life. That is why conversations about the Exodus rarely stay inside history. They quickly become conversations about loyalty, memory, meaning, and identity. The strange thing is that both believers and skeptics often fall into exactly the same psychological trap. One side sometimes assumes the story must be historically true because it has inspired billions and shaped civilizations for thousands of years. The other sometimes assumes it cannot be true because the archaeological evidence is debated or incomplete. Both reactions can skip the harder work of asking what historians actually mean when they say evidence. History is not a courtroom where every ancient event leaves fingerprints and surveillance footage. Ancient history is more like trying to reconstruct a conversation after finding a handful of letters, broken pottery, damaged monuments, abandoned cities, and texts copied over centuries. The absence of evidence in one place is not automatically evidence that nothing happened, but neither does a meaningful story automatically become historical proof simply because generations believed it. That uncomfortable middle ground frustrates people because certainty is emotionally satisfying while complexity rarely is. Imagine someone asking you to describe your great-grandparents. You may know their names, perhaps you have photographs, maybe someone told stories at family gatherings. But imagine another family with no photographs, no written records, only stories repeated from generation to generation. Would those stories automatically become false because physical evidence is missing? Not necessarily. Would they automatically become historically accurate because people sincerely believed them? Also, no. Most of us instinctively understand this distinction in our own families. Yet we often lose that balance when discussing famous historical traditions. The Exodus sits exactly in that difficult space where historical investigation, religious tradition, literary analysis, and cultural memory overlap. Some historians argue that no archaeological evidence currently supports the biblical description of hundreds of thousands or even millions of Israelites leaving Egypt and wandering for decades in the wilderness. They point out that Egyptian records are largely silent about such an event, that large-scale archaeological traces have not been found in the Sinai Desert, and that the settlement patterns in ancient Canaan appear more gradual than a sudden conquest. From this perspective, the biblical narrative may preserve theological meaning or collective memory rather than functioning as a straightforward historical report. Others caution against treating silence as a final verdict. Ancient Egypt rarely recorded national humiliations. Archaeology is incomplete by nature. Nomadic populations often leave remarkably little material evidence. Vast areas remain unexcavated. Erosion destroys evidence. Political instability limits research, and entire civilizations have surprised historians before through discoveries nobody expected. Some scholars suggest the Exodus tradition could preserve the memory of a smaller historical migration that later became expanded through generations of storytelling, liturgy, and national identity. Others explore connections with Semitic populations known to have lived in Egypt at different times, asking whether fragments of historical experience eventually merged into the biblical narrative familiar today. Notice something important. The conversation becomes much more interesting once certainty is replaced by careful questions. Instead of asking whether someone is trying to destroy faith or blindly defend tradition, historians ask what kind of evidence should reasonably exist if such an event occurred. They compare texts, languages, settlement patterns, climate records, inscriptions, and archaeological layers. Their goal is not necessarily to confirm or deny belief, but to understand the past as responsibly as possible. That approach feels emotionally unsatisfying because it often ends with probabilities instead of absolute conclusions. Human beings dislike probabilities. We crave simple endings. We want heroes and villains, certainty and closure, victory and defeat. Yet reality frequently refuses to cooperate. Think about how easily confidence persuades us. A speaker who says there is absolutely no evidence for the Exodus may sound convincing because confidence creates the illusion of certainty. Another speaker declaring the Exodus is unquestionably proven may sound equally persuasive for exactly the same psychological reason. Confidence affects emotions far more quickly than evidence affects understanding. That is why learning history requires intellectual patience. It demands the willingness to sit with unanswered questions longer than most conversations allow. It also requires recognizing how deeply identity shapes interpretation. Imagine two people reading the same archaeological report. One grew up believing the Exodus literally happened exactly as described. The other grew up believing religion is fundamentally mythological. Neither approaches the evidence as a blank slate. Both carry expectations formed long before they encountered the excavation report. Confirmation bias quietly begins working before either person reads the first sentence. The believer naturally notices details that seem consistent with tradition. The skeptic naturally notices details supporting doubt. Neither process necessarily involves dishonesty. It is simply how human cognition works. Our minds constantly search for coherence between new information and existing beliefs. That is why changing our minds feels psychologically expensive. We are not merely replacing an idea. We are reorganizing an entire mental map built over years or decades. This explains why debates about the Exodus often generate far more heat than light. Participants believe they are defending facts when they are often defending identity. Once identity enters the conversation, evidence alone rarely changes anyone. Social belonging becomes stronger than intellectual curiosity. You can see the same pattern everywhere: politics, diets, sports, economic theories, parenting advice. Once a belief becomes part of who we think we are, questioning it feels like personal rejection. The irony is that history itself teaches humility. Again and again, discoveries overturn previous assumptions. Entire civilizations once dismissed as legendary were later confirmed through archaeology. At the same time, other cherished traditions turned out to contain literary symbolism, theological shaping, or legendary development alongside historical memory. Responsible historians therefore resist declaring victory too quickly. They know both skepticism and certainty can become dogmas if they stop asking questions. The Exodus illustrates this beautifully because it forces everyone into intellectual discomfort. If you approach it assuming archaeology should perfectly match every biblical detail, you may become frustrated. If you approach it assuming ancient traditions never preserve authentic historical memory, you may overlook possibilities that deserve consideration. Reality often occupies territory neither extreme expects. Perhaps the deeper lesson hidden inside this debate has less to do with Egypt than with ourselves. Why do we so desperately want history to settle every existential question? Why do we expect archaeology to carry burdens it was never designed to bear? Even if tomorrow archaeologists uncovered dramatic new evidence connected to the Exodus, questions about meaning, purpose, morality, and faith would still remain. Likewise, if tomorrow someone demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that parts of the biblical narrative developed through centuries of literary tradition, millions would still wrestle with spiritual experiences, ethical teachings, and profound questions about existence. Historical investigation and personal belief overlap, but they are not identical. Confusing them creates endless misunderstanding. One person asks a historical question and receives a theological answer. Another asks a spiritual question and receives an archaeological lecture. Both leave frustrated because they were having different conversations without realizing it. That may be one of the most overlooked aspects of this entire debate. People often argue past one another because they never define what kind of truth they are discussing. Historical truth asks what most likely happened in the past, based on available evidence. Literary truth explores meaning conveyed through narrative. Theological truth considers divine purpose and revelation. Psychological truth examines why certain stories resonate across cultures and generations. These categories sometimes overlap, but they are not interchangeable. Recognizing the difference does not weaken honest inquiry. It strengthens it. It allows evidence to remain evidence without demanding that it answer questions beyond its scope. It allows belief to remain belief without pretending it functions as archaeological proof. Most importantly, it allows curiosity to survive where certainty might otherwise end the conversation. If this kind of reflection interests you, subscribe and keep exploring difficult questions with the same willingness to examine assumptions. Follow evidence where it leads, and think more carefully than the crowd usually asks us to. History becomes far more interesting when you stop asking whether a story must be either completely true or completely false. That habit of forcing every difficult question into two opposing camps says more about the modern mind than it does about the ancient world. We have become accustomed to instant answers. We expect a search engine to settle debates in seconds. We expect a headline to summarize centuries of scholarship. We expect a single archaeological discovery to either validate or destroy an entire tradition. Ancient history refuses to cooperate with that expectation. Instead, it rewards patience. It asks you to become comfortable with incomplete pictures, competing interpretations, and evidence that rarely speaks with one voice. The Exodus is one of the clearest examples of this reality because every new piece of information raises another question. Suppose you discover that Egyptian records do not clearly describe the biblical Exodus. What should that mean? One person immediately concludes the event never happened. Another argues that ancient kings rarely documented military defeats, political embarrassments, or national disasters. Both observations contain reasonable points. Ancient rulers often wrote propaganda rather than objective history. Victory was celebrated. Failure was minimized. Yet it is also reasonable to expect that an event of enormous scale might have left broader traces if it occurred exactly as described. Neither observation automatically ends the discussion. They simply establish the boundaries of what historians can responsibly claim. This is where psychology quietly returns to the conversation. Human beings often mistake the first explanation that feels emotionally satisfying for the best explanation. If someone already suspects religion exaggerates historical events, silence in Egyptian records feels like confirmation. If someone already trusts the biblical account, that same silence feels unsurprising because they expect ancient governments to hide humiliating episodes. The same fact produces two different conclusions because the interpretation begins before the evidence is examined. That should make every one of us pause. How often have you believed you were following evidence when you were actually following expectations? It is an uncomfortable realization because nobody enjoys discovering that their own mind is less objective than they imagined. Consider how memory works even within your own lifetime. Ask several siblings to describe the same family gathering from 20 years ago. One remembers laughter. Another remembers tension. One remembers a conversation that changed everything. Another barely recalls it. None of them is necessarily lying. Memory is selective. It organizes experience around meaning rather than perfect chronology. Now imagine that process unfolding across centuries instead of decades. Stories become part of communal identity. Important moments are retold during festivals. Children hear them from parents. Teachers emphasize certain themes. Details are clarified, expanded, condensed, or connected with later events. Eventually, the story becomes more than a recollection. It becomes the framework through which an entire people understand themselves. Many historians think something like this may have happened with the Exodus tradition. That does not necessarily mean the story was invented from nothing, nor does it necessarily mean every detail reflects a literal historical record. Collective memory often preserves genuine historical experiences while reshaping them to communicate deeper meaning. Entire nations do this, families do it, organizations do it. Every anniversary speech simplifies complicated events into narratives that explain who we believe ourselves to be. The longer those stories endure, the more central they become to identity. This possibility makes some people uncomfortable because they fear complexity weakens significance. But history suggests the opposite. A tradition can possess enormous cultural and spiritual influence regardless of whether every historical detail can be independently verified. Think about the role foundational stories play across civilizations. They establish shared values, explain origins, define purpose, and connect generations. Whether approached historically, literarily, or theologically, the Exodus has shaped law, ethics, politics, art, music, philosophy, and countless movements for freedom. Its influence is historically undeniable, even while discussions about its precise historical reconstruction continue. Ironically, the search for certainty sometimes blinds us to what is genuinely remarkable. People become so focused on proving or disproving one event that they overlook the extraordinary survival of the tradition itself. Civilizations rise and disappear. Languages vanish. Kingdoms collapse. Yet this narrative continued to be copied, recited, debated, interpreted, translated, and reinterpreted for thousands of years. That persistence itself deserves explanation. Why did this particular story endure, while countless others faded? Historical influence is also evidence of something, even if it is evidence of cultural significance, rather than direct confirmation of every historical claim. Another layer appears when archaeology enters public debate. Archaeology is often portrayed as though it functions like treasure hunting. People imagine dramatic discoveries instantly rewriting history. Real archaeological work is usually slower, quieter, and far less cinematic. Years of excavation may produce fragments of pottery, damaged inscriptions, food remains, foundations of buildings, or environmental data. Every object must be dated, compared, interpreted, and placed within broader contexts. Different specialists frequently disagree about what the same evidence means. Public discussions rarely communicate that uncertainty because uncertainty attracts fewer headlines than certainty. This creates another psychological trap. The public hears statements such as, "Archaeology proved this" or "Archaeology disproved that." Historians and archaeologists themselves are usually more careful. They speak about probabilities, competing models, changing interpretations, and the limitations of available evidence. Those nuances often disappear before reaching popular audiences. People prefer simple narratives because simple narratives reduce anxiety. Complexity demands intellectual effort. The Exodus debate therefore becomes a mirror reflecting something much larger than ancient Israel or ancient Egypt. It reveals how modern people consume information. We increasingly reward confidence over caution, certainty over curiosity, speed over understanding. The person who says everyone else is wrong sounds more impressive than the researcher, explaining why multiple interpretations remain plausible. Yet history repeatedly rewards the cautious thinker. New discoveries have overturned scholarly consensus before. Established assumptions have collapsed after unexpected evidence emerged. Humility is not weakness in historical inquiry. It is one of its greatest strengths. There is also an emotional reason this subject refuses to disappear. Freedom is one of humanity's deepest longings. Whether viewed historically or theologically, the Exodus has become one of the world's defining symbols of liberation. Enslaved communities have drawn hope from it. Civil rights leaders referenced it. Political revolutions echoed its themes. Individuals trapped in addiction, oppression, grief, or despair have seen their own struggles reflected in its narrative. The story speaks to something universal. Human beings instinctively understand the desire to leave behind a place of suffering, uncertainty, or bondage. That universality can sometimes complicate historical discussions. When a story becomes deeply meaningful, people naturally become protective of it. Criticism feels personal. Questions feel threatening. Yet meaningful stories should not fear careful examination. If an idea has endured for centuries, honest questions are unlikely to destroy it. Likewise, skepticism becomes healthier when it remains open to surprise, rather than assuming every ancient tradition must collapse under investigation. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden beneath this debate. Mature thinking is not measured by how quickly someone reaches certainty. It is measured by their willingness to remain intellectually honest even when the answer is incomplete. That requires courage because uncertainty feels lonely. Communities celebrate confident declarations far more often than careful restraint. Yet history belongs to those willing to keep asking difficult questions after easy answers lose their appeal. As you continue thinking about the Exodus, notice your own reactions. Which possibilities immediately feel attractive? Which ones make you uncomfortable? Why? Sometimes the most revealing discovery is not found beneath ancient sand, but inside our own assumptions. The questions that unsettle us often expose the beliefs we never realized had become part of our identity. That realization may be one of the most historically valuable discoveries any person can make. If exploring difficult questions without rushing towards simplistic conclusions is the kind of conversation you value, subscribe and continue examining history with curiosity, intellectual humility, and the willingness to let evidence challenge assumptions instead of merely confirming them. The strange thing about the Exodus debate is that, after enough reading, the question slowly changes. At first you ask whether the event happened exactly as described. Then you begin asking why people are so desperate for the answer to be either absolutely yes or absolutely no. That shift matters because it moves the conversation from ancient Egypt into the present day. Most of us like to believe we are rational observers evaluating evidence wherever it leads. Yet our relationship with truth is often far more emotional than we realize. We do not simply collect facts. We build identities around them. We create friendships around them. We raise children within them. We organize entire communities around shared assumptions. Once that happens, changing our minds no longer feels like learning. It feels like losing part of ourselves. That explains why discussions surrounding the Exodus can become surprisingly emotional even among people who rarely think about archaeology. The conversation is rarely confined to ancient history. For many believers, the narrative is woven into a much larger understanding of God's relationship with humanity. For many skeptics, questioning the historical evidence represents a commitment to critical inquiry and methodological consistency. Neither motivation is inherently irrational. Problems arise when either side mistakes commitment for certainty. One of the most valuable habits historians develop is learning to distinguish between what they know, what they suspect, and what they simply do not know. That sounds simple until you try applying it to your own life. Think about how often people confidently repeat statistics they never verified, stories they only heard secondhand, or claims that align perfectly with their worldview. Social media rewards certainty. News cycles reward confidence. Public debates reward memorable sound bites. Few rewards exist for saying the evidence is incomplete, the sources disagree, or the answer remains uncertain. Ancient history is full of these uncertainties. Entire cities have disappeared beneath layers of earth for centuries before being rediscovered. Civilizations once dismissed as legendary later proved historical. At the same time, some long-accepted traditions have been revised as new evidence emerged. That is why responsible historical work remains open to revision. New inscriptions, improved dating methods, environmental studies, linguistic analysis, and archaeological discoveries all have the potential to reshape existing models. None of this guarantees that future discoveries will confirm or deny the Exodus in any particular way. It simply reminds us that history is an ongoing investigation rather than a finished verdict. There is another lesson hidden in this process: that applies far beyond religion. Human beings frequently confuse confidence with competence. Someone speaking forcefully about the Exodus may sound persuasive regardless of whether their conclusions accurately reflect current scholarship. This is not unique to history. The same pattern appears in finance, medicine, politics, and everyday life. Our brains naturally associate certainty with expertise because certainty reduces anxiety, but reality often belongs to those willing to admit complexity. Imagine two guides leading travelers through a dense forest. One confidently insists he knows every path, despite never consulting a map. The other regularly checks landmarks, compares directions, and occasionally admits uncertainty when the terrain changes. The first guide may appear stronger in the moment. The second is often more reliable over the long journey. Historical inquiry resembles the second guide. It values correction over pride because the goal is not to defend personal certainty, but to approach reality as honestly as possible. This is where the Exodus becomes surprisingly relevant, even for people who have no religious commitments. The debate teaches intellectual character. It reminds us that evidence deserves patience, that disagreement does not automatically imply dishonesty, and that sincere people can interpret the same information differently without abandoning reason. Those are valuable lessons in an age increasingly divided into competing certainties. The conversation also reveals something profound about the human search for meaning. Whether viewed as historical memory, theological narrative, literary tradition, or some combination of these, the Exodus continues to resonate because it speaks to experiences nearly everyone understands. Feeling trapped, hoping for deliverance, facing uncertainty after leaving what was familiar, discovering that freedom often introduces new challenges instead of immediate comfort. These themes remain psychologically powerful because they reflect recurring patterns in human life. That does not resolve historical questions, nor should it. Historical investigation asks one set of questions, while existential reflection asks another. Confusing the two creates unnecessary conflict. A historical claim should be examined using historical methods. A theological claim belongs within theology. A philosophical question requires philosophical reasoning. A psychological observation draws on psychology. These approaches sometimes intersect, but none completely replaces the others. Recognizing these distinctions allows conversations to become more productive. Instead of demanding that archaeology settle every spiritual question or expecting faith to function as archaeological evidence, we can appreciate that different disciplines address different aspects of reality. This does not weaken either historical inquiry or personal belief. It simply prevents us from asking one field to answer questions outside its scope. Perhaps the greatest danger in any discussion about the past is believing we have reached the point where no further questions are necessary. Curiosity is one of humanity's most valuable intellectual virtues. It protects us from arrogance. It reminds us that knowledge grows through investigation rather than assumption. It encourages humility without requiring indecision. The goal is not to remain permanently uncertain about everything. The goal is to proportion confidence to the strength of the available evidence. That principle extends well beyond the Exodus. It applies whenever we inherit beliefs from our families, communities, schools, or cultures. Every generation receives ideas that deserve gratitude, ideas that deserve careful examination, and ideas that deserve revision. Wisdom lies in learning the difference. Rejecting every tradition simply because it is old is no more rational than accepting every tradition simply because it is familiar. If there is one uncomfortable truth that emerges from the historical discussion surrounding the Exodus, it is this: reality owes none of us the comfort of absolute certainty. Some questions remain open because the available evidence genuinely leaves room for multiple responsible interpretations. Accepting that fact requires intellectual maturity. It asks us to value honesty above victory and understanding above tribal loyalty. The irony is that this approach often produces deeper confidence rather than less. Confidence grounded in careful inquiry is quieter than confidence built on slogans, but it is also more resilient. It is willing to learn. It is willing to adapt. It is willing to admit mistakes. And because it is not afraid of difficult questions, it does not need to silence them. The next time someone asks whether the Exodus can be historically verified, perhaps the most thoughtful response is not to rush toward a simple conclusion, but to recognize the richness of the question itself. Historical evidence continues to be studied. Scholarly interpretations continue to evolve. Theological convictions continue to shape how many people understand the narrative. Each perspective contributes something meaningful to the conversation when presented honestly and with appropriate humility. In the end, the real challenge may not be deciding which conclusion feels most comfortable. The real challenge is becoming the kind of person who values truth enough to follow the evidence carefully, acknowledge its limits, and resist the temptation to confuse certainty with understanding. That habit will serve you not only when thinking about the Exodus, but whenever you encounter questions that touch history, identity, and meaning. If these conversations encourage you to examine assumptions, weigh evidence carefully, and remain curious even when easy answers are tempting, subscribe and continue exploring the questions that have shaped human thought for thousands of years.